what is wanted by the Palestinians, the Israelis, how it's being run in Washington. Can you respond?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first, to put this in context, we have to remember that, Israel has no greater ally in the world than the United States. It relies heavily on the United States, both economically, diplomatically, and militarily for support. So the United States has a good bit of leverage over Israel. It also has a good bit of leverage over the Palestinian Authority. It provides a significant amount of money for its annual budget. And so, it's not miraculous that the United States is able to bring two essentially clients to the table to do something. The question is, why has it been so difficult to do so? And the answer to that is because of a failure of U.S. mediation over the years, time and time again. And so I think what we should be looking for here, if these talks are going to have any hope of moving forward in any positive direction, is the way in which the U.S. approaches handling its role as a mediator. In the past, unfortunately, instead of acting as an enforcer of international law, as an enforcer of Israeli obligations and previous commitments, the United States has only acted instead as an enforcer of Israeli positions in the negotiations. And so if you're on the Palestinian end, there's really no interest for you to keep going back to negotiations that only act as a cover for Israel's continued colonial activities in the West Bank.
Norman, what's your sense of why these talks are taking place right now? And give us your assessment of where you think the various parties are at.
Well, on the Palestinian side, they really don't have much choice because the Palestinian economy was almost in a crisis last year, just at the time Salam Fayyad, the prime minister, left office. And Obama basically told him that if you don't go to talks, we're not going to pay the bills. On the Israeli side, they had one immediate motive. The immediate motive was they wanted to deflect international pressure on them. The Israeli press was reporting that, as is true, in order to deflect international pressure, you have to pretend to be negotiating. And the Israelis didn't panic, but they saw it as a harbinger when the European Union issued its guidelines, which were not going to have a huge impact, but guidelines which threatened Israel's ability, its maneuverability, in continuing its annexation of the Palestinian territories. The U.S. goal is a little bit more interesting, and it requires a historical perspective. If you look at the last three presidencies, Clinton, then Bush, and then Obama, in each of the three presidencies, at the end of the terms, the 8-year terms, there were attempts to negotiate a settlement. In the Clinton presidency, the purpose was clearly Clinton wanted to redeem himself after the Monica Lewinsky scandal. In the Bush presidency, the negotiations came in 2008, and the purpose again was pretty clear that Condoleezza Rice in particular, she was Secretary of State at the time, and she was looking for somehow to redeem her role as the Secretary of State in what was the end of the Bush administration, a complete disaster. Now, Obama is facing the same problem, namely his is a failed presidency, and even though he's a narcissist, he knows that. The presidency has been a disaster, and just like Clinton and just like the Bush administration, he's now hoping that maybe he can pull a rabbit out of the hat with the Israel-Palestine conflict and redeem, as Clinton hoped to do and as Condoleezza Rice hoped to do, and redeem his record in at least foreign policy. And so each of them has a different motive, but we have to be clear that this time circumstances are slightly different. That is, number one, the Arab world is shattered right now. Hamas, the principal opponent of the collaborationist Palestinian Authority, has been reduced to a nullity because it put all of its eggs in the Brotherhood basket
in Egypt.
The Palestinians are more depressed, despondent, despairing, and depoliticized than ever. And the Palestinian Authority is now more enthralled to the United States than ever. And so there is a hope, there is a possibility that this time they may be able to push through the Israeli terms of settlement. And the Israeli terms of settlement are very clear. Israel has said it over and over again. We're building a wall. The wall is our final border. And the wall consists of annexing about 10% of the West Bank, fragmenting what remains of the West Bank, annexing some of the most arable soil, annexing the critical water resources, annexing the hub of Palestinian life, namely East Jerusalem, and there'll be some sort of international consortium to solve the refugee problem. There is a possibility that they can ram it through this time.
Speaking to Israeli Army radio last year, the new U.S. envoy, Martin Indyk, expressed doubts that Israel-Palestinian talks could yield a peace deal. In the clip, he refers to Mahmoud Abbas as Abu Mazen.
I'm not particularly optimistic because I think that the heart of the matter is that the maximum concessions that this government of Israel would be prepared to make fall far short of the minimum requirements that Abu Mazen will insist on. So it may be possible to keep the talks going, which is a good thing, but I find it very hard to believe that they will reach an agreement.
Yusuf Munir, can you talk about who Martin Indyk is, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel leading these talks, and also to Norman Finkelstein talking about the depoliticization and despondency of the Palestinians?
Sure, and let me just say about that Martin Indyk quote, which I think is so interesting. If you mention it's from last year, he's talking then about a right-wing Israeli government which has since become even more right-wing and even more beholden to the interests of religious nationalist settler parties that are now in the current Israeli government. So I think the Israeli government's positions, the minimum that they're willing to give, the maximum that they're willing to give has shrunk even more under this current Israeli government. Martin Indyk, I think the question about him, it's not really about him as an individual, but really about what he represents when it comes to American mediation of these negotiations. Look, Martin Indyk is someone who very clearly has a pro-Israel background, pro-Israel advocacy and work on his resume. It's very clear what his positions have been in the past and who he's associated himself with. But I think the interesting thing is you could never imagine the United States appointing someone in that position as a special envoy to the negotiations who has the exact same resume but from a Palestinian end. And I think that just speaks to the fact that the administration is still very conscious and prepared to defer to the concerns of pro-Israel interest groups in the United States when it comes to how it mediates the negotiations. And that, if anyone had any hope for a different U.S. position towards the negotiations this time around, suggests that is simply not the case.